Any further questions? Colonel Hanson.
Perhaps a rather parochial question, gentlemen, related to the formation of my own corps in 1944. There was an awful lot of competition for skilled manpower in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, and of course, there must have been for civilian industry, and I wondered if you had a problem getting the skilled technicians you needed to build the vehicles, considering we had, what, 1 million men and women in uniform at that time? And did you have any labor problems? The sorts of things we're seeing now with General Motors negotiating with international auto workers and things like that.
No?
I'll answer yes.
Well, no, when you think of it, when Herb was setting up plants over in England, and said one was a cardboard box factory, one was a chocolate factory. Now, in the trading estate of Slough, that was a Citroën plant, and they were quite, the only thing that worried me was it took 2 men to tighten a nut and bolt. That always got me, one man holding the head and the other man turning the nut. But otherwise, really, I don't think they had any problem with finding labor. My daughter works on the assembly line right now, and she is a forestry graduate.
Well, in Canada, if you're talking about Canadian production, in Canada, we were just coming out of the worst depression that the country had ever seen, and there were a lot of people very anxious to work. I could mention that I don't know what effect it had. There were no UAW operations in any of the motor companies. I'm not sure about General Motors. It hadn't started actually yet. So whether that affected it or not, I don't know. But I think it was more a case of people were anxious to help. People had been out of work and were glad to get pretty high pay because there was a hell of a lot of overtime until such time as the government put some ceilings on it. But I don't recall any difficulty in getting the kind of help the auto plants needed. The main thing was getting suppliers.
UAW started in a small way in '36 in Oshawa.
There was a strike in '45 when I came home.
Yeah. Jack Wallace.
This may have some relevance. When I was aboard and I was an instructor in the early years of 1939, or at least in the first war years, 39, on drivers. And I would say that less than 50% of the people that came to me had never driven a vehicle. So right away you had a society of young people who were not necessarily mechanically minded. Now, carrying this on into a tank production field, I read this in the archives, and Colonel James may recall the incident of a military officer going down and watching this great company, somebody was referring to CPR, starting to assemble the first Ram tanks. And they had all their parts there, but they had 12 people counting washers. And the military officer wondered what this was all about, and he asked, and he said, well, we're supposed to be sending $1 million to somebody. And there were 12 guys around counting washers. Now, they were inside tank hulls, and they were painting with paintbrushes. They weren't using sprays. So that I think that, generally speaking, if you got people doing jobs, you found a variation throughout the country, depending upon where you went. But I think at the start of the war, there was certainly no mechanically minded citizenry on which to draw. And we, and the Army, the military as a whole, had to start from scratch. And not only did they have their own schools, but they had to go to industry. They had to go to places like Autolite in Toronto on Bay Street there to train mechanics. And they had to use all facilities. So there was really a shortage to get people into the throw of things. It goes back to the question the fellow asked before about the Rascallian drivers. Well, we didn't have many Rascallian drivers to start with. Today it'd be a different situation. We're in an entirely different milieu.
I'd like to say a further word to that manpower thing. This is a very highly generalized thing, but in 6 years' war, I never heard anybody ever offer an excuse that they couldn't do something for lack of manpower in Canada.
Not for lack of manpower, but the skills weren't available yet.
Sid Swallow and I went to Vickers and Newcastle-on-Tyne and watched them making Valentine tanks.
Oh.
And they had a staff of 4,000, and they were making 1 tank a day. And they were putting the tank hulls through a shaper and bluing them, marking off the spots for the suspension. Or one man would drill a hole, somebody else would tap it, and then they hoped that they'd fit. They put fitters on it. Whereas when CPR built them in Montreal, they made a template for the side with the holes in it and just whammed right at it and did it all in one operation. And I don't know what the comparison of manpower is, but 4,000 men and making...
They were used to building battleships, of course. That's sort of a one-off.
I'd like to make maybe a couple of comments myself, if I could, by the way of this. When we're finished here, you want to slide that door closed. There are some photocopies out of the House magazine of Hamilton Bridge, which is probably the same as the ones from Inglis or anything else. It's you know what House magazines are of any industry, and it shows the people. There are some very interesting pictures there of the people who are working in the plant. The welding school, which I think is 40% female. This is 1942. And it gives you a little bit of an idea of that thing. The other the personal observation I can, one of my mother's best friends during the war, I remember, was working at Inglis, and she was running up to as many as 4 milling machines on a catwalk. And she was doing it 60 hours a week. That's one way the work got done. Now, I'm putting my nose out here with industrial people, but I remember that as a child. And the work ethic was alive and well because of the Depression. People were glad of the work. And 60 hours a week was not unheard of in plants. And running 2 machines was not unheard of. It would not be allowed now for union reasons. But those are some of the reasons things got done. We're running close to 3 o'clock. Do you want to continue? Or are you ready to get up? It's been a long time.
Day 2 of the seminar dealt with the formation of Canada's Armored Corps and the production of armored vehicles in Canada. From modest beginnings in 1938 with feeble Carden-Lloyd carriers and Vickers Dragons, the Canadian soldier learned the art of armored warfare. There was the formation of the Armored Fighting Vehicles School at Camp Borden and the production of armored vehicles by a country that had virtually no expertise in this type of manufacturing. The seminar brought forward the development of General Worthington's Ram tank, a Canadian hybrid that served as the basis for the legendary Sherman. The men involved recalled the events during the production of more than 1,000 Valentine tanks, more than 2,000 Sexton self-propelled guns, and more than 40,000 other armored vehicles, including the coveted Universal Carrier.
Bill introduced us as this end of the table more or less as originals. But first of all, I think I better define this word originals. Bob Harris and George Farmer at the end there are the part of the original originals. There were 20 men designated to come to form the Canadian Tank School, and in the end 18 turned up, and George and Bob are part of that group. There was a second group that came in subsequent to them up until the beginning of the war, and that brought their numbers up to about 30. And then the third group of originals are Archie McGuinness, John Cross, and myself, and Roger Jobson. We were the ones that joined up when war was declared. So I want to pay tribute particularly to the originals, and we'll give them a chance to tell us how they got started. And if there's any great argumentation, I have got the drafts of the chapters of the formation of the Canadian Tank School, and so I will act as the arbiter. Now, before we get started, I'd like to also portray for you that if many of you were like me, the first thing that Canada did about tanks happened around 1936 when Worthy entered the picture. But I want you to remember that in the First World War, there were a number of people who were the originators of armor for Canada. One was a fellow by the name of Brutinel, ended up the war the commander of the machine gun corps. He, in August 1914, organized the 1st Motor Machine Gun Battalion, which was equipped with 6 armored cars, or 8 armored cars. 2 of them were shot up in March 1918, and the other 6 survived. And 1 is at the War Museum in Ottawa. In Toronto, this is a little known fact, in Toronto in 1915, Canada produced 40 armored cars, which were supposed to equip the motor machine gun batteries. And somewhere along the line, to make a long story short, the Canadian military headquarters in London lost track of them. And in the end, they were found again about 1917, and the Canadians said, oh, well, we don't need any. And so they sold them to the Indian Army, or gave them to the Indian Army. And then unknown to the Indians who were having them down at Basingstoke being modified for Indian conditions, the British stole 22 of them. Borrowed is the word, I think. And sent them off to Ireland. Now, the other group that was left went out to India, and for the period from about 1918 until 1922, the greatest number of armored cars in Ireland, dealing with the Troubles, and those in India, were of Canadian Toronto manufacture. Now, besides that, there were 3 Canadian tank battalions being raised in the First World War. And then we run in after, none got into action. And then, of course, there was the period, the interwar period. And people think of it as a period in which there was no thinking about armor. But nothing could be farther from the truth. There were a lot of people thinking of armor in the interwar years. Unfortunately, the big dollar sign was the problem. And as these gentlemen here will possibly know, George and Bob Harris, that in that interwar period when they assembled those first group of people, they had them on what a military term called on command, because it meant their units were paying them to be soldiers with worthy, because they didn't have the money to even pay 18 more soldiers. And it was a real piece of chicanery, and the chief of the general staff didn't like it very much, but he couldn't do anything about it because the adjutant general was the one who was handling the purse strings in that regard. So 1936, we're coming into a new era when the first tank battalions are formed, and it's decided that there needs to be a training school, and it's called the Canadian Tank School, and it was formed in London, Ontario, according to the orders on 1st November 1936. And I think to get the story going, I think I'll follow Bill's format of yesterday, and we'll come down the line, and each person will have a 5 or 10 minutes to explain what his involvement was, what he saw happening, how he was taken by it, and we'll just let the questions flow from after that. So I think it's appropriate we start with George Farmer, who, by the way, is in one of Bill's books in a photograph dated 1932. At that time, he was a Lance Bombardier with the artillery up in Camp Petawawa. And it was from the artillery that he came to the Canadian Tank School. So George Farmer, would you lead off?
I'd be glad to. Well, I first reported to the Canadian Armoured Fighting Vehicle School in London, Ontario, Wolseley Barracks, in 1936. We've had some discussions add back, and I can't be sure of the exact month. But we found there that all the other personnel that arrived were attached only, on loan, from our respective permanent active military units. Some came from the cavalry, some from the infantry, and some came from the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, Kingston. I myself came from the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. I spent 8 years with that branch of the service, gradually working up to artillery staff course and fully qualified to become and be posted as an instructor of gunnery with the Royal School of Artillery, who was then commanded by the late Major General Simmons. I proceeded on furlough in '35, and Brigade tried to find me to send me on a Royal School in Montreal. They didn't locate me, so when I arrived back, my CO said someone else had been sent. I had been posted to the Canadian Armoured Fighting Vehicle School in London. I don't remember the exact month we arrived there, but it was in '36, and we had no tanks, no training aids, and we had to content ourselves with driving and maintenance of a few machine gun carriers, infantry machine gun carriers. Some courses were given in machine guns to those who had no experience, remembering that the infantry had lots of experience in machine guns. Cavalry, I'm not sure. Certainly the artillery had none, so we had some machine guns. Approximately 1937 or 1938, I'm not sure which, the school was transferred to Camborden, and I was posted to the D&M school. It was not until the outbreak of war where we were removed from being on loan from our respective units. We had to sign a document waiving our right to go back to our unit at the outbreak of war. And we also had to sign to go active, because the Canadian Permanent Active Militia, their terms of service were just to serving Canada only, for defense of Canada. In 1938, a scheme took place in the vicinity of Allison, and Major Wellington was asked to, in this scheme, where the permanent force were pitted against the militia. The militia on horses, the permanent active militia was supposed to be mechanized. Wellington was asked to take tanks, demonstrate the use of tanks and armored cars against the militia. All he had was our own private cars with the banner draped on them, designating whether we were a tank or an armored car. Bob Harris was one of them in that scheme. I was posted to the D&M school, and we had very little in the way of armor at all. We would spend most of our time in preparing traces on lesson plans for teaching all kinds of systems of mechanical vehicles. Many personnel came from the Army Tank Regiments to take these courses, 6 weeks in duration. It was just a treadmill of courses. In 1939, the outbreak of war, I still was posted to the D&M school. Gradually, I moved up to school sergeant major. First course, one of the first courses that I ran was a course on Worthy's tanks from the First Great War. And it was a complete fiasco, because over the weekend, the Army Tank Regiments had cannibalized all the vehicles. Engines missing, fuel systems, and so on. So we spent the whole time in putting them in shape. Eventually, we got one of the Valentine tanks. I understand 2 came altogether. I had the experience of taking one down to the Angus workshop, where they were very proud of the fact that they could manufacture them there. In due course, I moved up to the rank of lieutenant to captain. I took over the D&M school when Johnny Andrews went to the Army Tank Regiments. There were 2 attempts to get me back to the artillery. One was my CO, on a tour of inspection, he found nothing at Camborden. He said, you've got no equipment, you're just wasted here. Say the word, I'll take you back. But I was so caught up with the enthusiasm that was generated from Major Worthington down that I said I was quite happy to stay. Later, in '42, a colonel who was forming an SP man school heard that I had qualified on the artillery staff course. He wanted me to be chief instructor of this organization and asked that I go on a special course in England. Canadian Armoured Corps turned it down. I was sent on a cook's tour in 42 to England. Went through the usual thing, tour of base workshops at Borden. I was then sent up to Mildenhall, where I was attached to a British tank regiment, where we had crusaders, and they were just doing nothing else but sweep up the camp. So the CO, in order to find me something to do, sent me up on a divisional scheme in Yorkshire Moors. I was attached to the Lothian Border Yeomanry for that scheme. It was all cross country. You could use no vehicles to follow the scheme, so I rode on the squadron commander's tank. From there, I was shipped down to Bovington, took the instructor's course at Bovington on General Lee's and General Grant's, then shipped back to England, to Canada. There I was reposted to the D&M school at Borden. In due course, the training centres that had become, at the outbreak of war, instead of Armoured Fighting Vehicle School, they were called A8, A9. And they were merged and formed what is known as the A33, Canadian Armoured Fighting Vehicle School. In 44, I was shipped over as a reinforcement and posted to number 3 Cacru at Blackdown. CO interviewed all officers, and he asked me how old I was. I said I was 35. Too damn old. He says, what the hell did you come over for? Get over and take that D&M school over. He says, I'm taking you off your training. From there, I asked to take the school out on the field conditions. I felt we could get more training hours in that way. Brigade was delighted with the idea, and they said, you're going to do field training. So I was ordered to form 5 field training squadrons and train officers, gunner ops, wireless operators, drivers on the field training conditions. In due course, the order came down that only battle trained officers could be in charge of field training. I was posted then to Chief Instructor of 3 Cacru. From there, I went on the reinforcement course. By that time the war was over. I fired the battle course at Lulworth and then shipped to the Governor General Horse Guards at Aston, Holland. The men at that time then were doing rehabilitation training to go back to civilian life, and all I found them doing was reading Legion textbooks. So the officer in charge at the time that I worked with, a Major Crosby from Newfoundland, I suggested getting some practical training for them. He says, I don't know where you'd get it around here. I said, there must be a technical school. We located one. And the principal there said, I've got a problem, you've got a problem. I've got all the machines and instructors, but no materials or welding rod or all that sort of thing. We solved this problem and he solved that. And then I was in due course posted back to Canada, A33, and applied for service in the interim army. My application was rejected, and the telegram said the ground was I was over age according to the decided standards, and I could accept WO2 or retire. I saw no future in it, so I retired. Followed the rehab training with DVA and tried to build on my experience, academic experience I'd gained in the grammar school in England. Took my BA and went on to law school and graduated and practiced law thereafter.
So there's a military career from about 1930, eh, George?
29.
29
Yes.
you joined up.
Yes.
Now there are some terms that George used in the course of his talk that I think I should spell out for you. He talked about D&M. That's driving and maintenance. And it's one of the, it was anyways, the key elements of training of armored troops was to ensure that they knew how to drive and how to maintain their vehicles. And I happen to have here a memorandum from Worthy in 1938 telling Army headquarters in Ottawa, that course, the driving and maintenance course, would be 6 weeks duration, and a gunnery and tactics course would be 4 weeks duration. A driving course would be 4 weeks, and radio telegraphy 6 weeks. And that was the plan that Worthy had for his training program whenever he got instructors. He mentioned Johnny Andrews. Lieutenant Colonel John Andrews commanded the 14th Armored Regiment, or the Army Tank Battalion as it was known as in those days, that went in at Dieppe. He had been one of Worthy's originals, and besides that, back into the 1930s, he and Worthy tried to train the 2nd Armored Car Regiment in Winnipeg, Manitoba, by putting some kind of a turret on top of a Cardin Lloyd so that they could go up to St. Charles Ranges and try and shoot a machine gun. So there's the reference to Johnny Andrews. And then Bovington, of course, is the big tank school in the UK. A8 Training Center was the successor unit of the Canadian Tank School. Started off Canadian Tank School, then it was renamed Canadian Armored Fighting Vehicle School, and then it became the Canadian Armored Fighting Vehicles Training Center, and then it became A8 Training Center. So it went through a number of name changes, and then as George mentioned, there was another one added, A9, and then they merged a couple of them. Now we have another original, namely Bob Harris, who came from the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and you have to be careful, Bob, of what you have to say about them, because I've got a letter here from the commanding officer of one of your squadrons having something to say about the people he sent to the school. I'll let everybody in on it after you had your chat. But you might tell us how you got involved into the unit, and then some of the things that you did when you were at the school.
Well, perhaps I could expand a little bit on what George Farmer said about the Canadian Tank School in London. But first of all, I was in the RAF in the 18 War as an observer. I came to Canada in 1920, joined the RCDs. How I came to join was a bunch of chaps was on the ship who had been recruited in England. And in talking with them, they said, why don't you join up? Which I did. I never really had any intention of doing that, and so at Quebec City, we were inducted into the Canadian Army, and I was in the RCD, the Royal Canadian Dragoons. And there I went to St. John's, Quebec. There 10 years, got on the instruction category, and transferred to Regiment Headquarters in Toronto by Colonel Timmis. In 1936, December 36, I was posted to London, to the Canadian Tank School. I was then or going to, and from there we expanded very much. We resurrected an old Buick engine. We got two badly used Cardin Lloyds, I believe, from the RCR, and we played around with those, tore them down, assembled them, and we tried to get into the automotive end and some gunnery. But we didn't accomplish too much in London. Then in the April 38, we moved to Borden. That's where our dates somewhat conflict. But it was April 38, so we were in London from December, I would say, at least when I was there, and I think most of the other chaps had been posted at that time. Once again, I will go back to the number. There was 12 selected from the various units in Canada: cavalry, artillery, bandoos, and RCDs, LSH, and the RCR. And there were 6 officers, not counting Major Worthington. Eventually, we got to our organisation as Jack Wallace mentioned. And I was put into gunnery, and from there on, soon after that, in October 19, then the war came about, and I went to England to Lowell, and the number went to Boston. And there we were there in October 40 to, I think, April 41. Came back, and I was posted to the gunnery wing, and more or less I stayed with the gunnery wing almost at the end of the war. From there, I took a 13th mule convoy to India. They were mules destined for the 14th Army in Burma. When I came back, I was demobilized.
There's one thing I think that is pretty obvious. I'm not sure if George mentioned how he got to the Canadian Tank School. He arrived there, but I noticed that Bob said he was posted. There wasn't a hell of a lot of volunteer spirit in the Army in those days. And these fellows were posted into these units, and sometimes they had some problems about why they should be at a unit where they were not going to get any promotion. Now, I did mention earlier that of the first 20 that were supposed to come along, only 18 showed up, and these were two of them. That included the officers as well. I happen to have a picture from the old sergeant major of the group at that time, and this is the only picture that I know that's in existence showing the originals. But Worthy still wanted to fill those 2 vacancies, and so the old word went out to the various PF units, the commanding officers, to send some more men. And this is what the officer commanding A Squadron of the Royal Canadian Dragoons had to say about this terrible state of affairs. He stated that 1 officer and 1 sergeant, now the officer was Howie LaRocque and the sergeant was Bob Harris, have already been detailed to the staff of the Canadian Tank School, and that due to the additional personnel required for instruction in both arms, it has been found almost impossible to deplete this unit any further. This is 1938. Or 37. As the requirements to run a horsed unit is already depleted considerably to supply personnel for maintenance, care, and driving of armored car and recce cars allotted to this unit. Now, at that time, the at least the RCDs had 1 armored car, and they had what they called a reconnaissance car, which was nothing more than a Ford Phaeton, which had one of those rollback tops on it. And that was what they called a recce car. But that was how tough it was to get a man out of a unit. They had to look after those bloody horses. So, I'd like to also mention that they really had a problem getting organized at that school because they didn't have 1 training aide, as George Farmer indicated. And I have here, and this is on the record, as late as June 1938, this was like 1 month after they'd got into Camp Borden, just 1 month away from the first course, number 1, they only had 4 Cardin Lloyds. And the worst of it, they did not have a single armored vehicle style of the Vickers machine gun. The machine gun that went into an armored fighting vehicle was slightly different from the ordinary infantry.
Pistol grip.
Was that what it was?
Through the spirit.
Now, there's another man will be telling us something about this. And fortunately, there were 4 in Canada and had just been installed in the experimental armored cars. These were 2 that were manufactured, 1 by General Motors and 1 by Ford in 1935, sent one each to the RCDs and the LSH. Orders went out from Ottawa that a special Mark 6 machine gun be dispatched on temporary loan to the school at Borden. As well, orders went out to get the Cardin Lloyds dispatched from the Royal 22nd Regiment and the PPCLI. When these arrived, Worthington wrote a note of thanks to Major Gordon Whitelaw in Ottawa, saying, "The machine guns were a godsend, but the Cardin Lloyds sent from Calgary were, quote, in a bloody awful state." So this is what they had to put up with. Now we'll move into the second group of originals now, and Roger can you know, the personnel selection in those days was, as I say, it was something to behold, particularly when you saw that these fellows were dragooned into these units and they didn't really have a heck of a lot to say about it. And I think, you know, with this fellow on my left, Roger Jobson, you'll see that personnel selection, we could have used it, you know, but somehow or other, Worthy picked him, and here he is. Okay, Roger?
Well, thanks very much, Jake. I think I should start to let you know that I first acquaintance with the Army was in 1919. I was going to a boys' school in Calgary, and the headmaster happened to be the OC of the 91st Battery of Artillery. And any of the boys that were big enough or old enough were in that battery, some 45 of us. It was very good. We trained every Tuesday night for a couple of hours, and we got $1.10 that evening, which was returned back to the battery. And then we used to go to Sarcee for 2 weeks at the 1st July, which coincided with the Calgary Stampede, and that was very handy. I kept contact with them after I left the school in 1921 until 1929. And I found that the fact that you could go there and you had a place to camp and also go to the Stampede was very handy. Well, after that particular time, if you remember, you heard of the Great Depression in the West, I got mixed up with the Ford Motor Company's dealers. And I did everything from sell cars to service them, learn to be a mechanic, was supposed to be a mechanic, and eventually the Ford dealers that were handy to me, they all went broke, and I spent about 6 months with Traders Finance undoing what I'd done before. And then eventually I started off my own, and factually I was very lucky because although there was no great price for the grain and things out there, in the place I was at near North Battleford, there was lots of it. And you'd see elevators, teams lined up waiting to get in, you see. And believe it or not, 2 years in a row I made $6,000, which was pretty damn good in those days. And this was because I concocted a mobile repair effort and used to go out and repair the farmer's tractor right in his yard. And then I sold radios. Well, after that, a while the drought moved up there and there was nothing to come in. So I decided to pull up stakes, which I did with a wife at that time and a son, and came down here to Ontario, and I met a friend in Toronto, and he sent me out to see the service manager of the Ford Motor Company, a fellow named Eaton. And Eaton must have needed me right away because he just phoned the Chittick Motors in Barrie, and I went up to see them, and I was it, service manager. That went along very fine, and eventually why I got to know some of the customers, and one of the customers used to come in quite frequently was Mrs. Worthington. She had her car, she had Peter, and she had Robin. And it's a very nice acquaintanceship, you know, grew. Eventually the old boy used to come in himself once in a while and drunk and so forth. There's one time he came in, and he was in a light truck. And he was on the scrounge. They had no money to buy anything in those days. At all, you couldn't buy a damn thing. He wanted a half-horsepower motor. And what did he want it for? Well, they had the Ripas. And the boys, this Ripa is a roll-yawl pitch action thing. And the boys had a beam gun on it. And these fellows got too good at the beam gun and ringing the bell. When you hit the target, the bell rang, you see, so he had to just smarten them up a little bit on that deal. And he had two transmissions, car transmissions, hooked up, coupled up, and strapped on a plank. Now, where the hell he got this from, I don't know. But Johnny Andrews was with him. And he told me what he wanted, and I looked at the thing. I didn't know him too well. I looked at the thing, and I said, Jesus, this looks like a Heath Robinson effort. Well, Jesus. Purple started to come around here, and the hair went up. And he said, well, if you know a better one, design it. And got in a truck and burned it off. So I thought, well, there goes a customer. And it wasn't long that afternoon why Johnny Andrews came in, and I suggested that he get a half-horsepower motor somewhere where he could scrounge, or a third-horsepower motor, and get a rheostat. And I think maybe, I don't know what the hell happened, but I never got involved in that anymore, I can tell you that. But about 2 weeks later, why, the Worthington car pulled in, and old Worthington got out and come over, and says, come here. He says, understand you've got your commission in the Gray and Simcoe Foresters. And I said, that's right. Well, you know, he said, we could do with you in the Army, the active Army. And I said, well, I have to think about that for a while. Well, he said, you think about it. And I said, you meet me, if you will, or can, come out to Camp Borden and meet me at the mess at 5 o'clock Friday afternoon. So I went out to the mess on Friday afternoon. I'd made up my mind, and talked it over with my wife, and decided that this may have to happen anyway, may as well do it now. And I'll never forget old Worthy coming across the parade ground, those long strides he used to take. And he came up, we're sitting out in the veranda, your father was sitting out in the veranda, and he shook hands and he says, I've got to go and get changed and have a shower, come with me. Went out to his quarters, and we were talked all the time there, and we decided this was all right. I would get in the Army. And he said, I'm going up to Ottawa on Monday. He said, I'll make the arrangements up there, and you will be hearing from me. Well, I heard from Jack's father on Tuesday that T.V. Anderson, wasn't it? There was the Inspector General. Mm-hmm. He was coming, and the trip to Ottawa was canceled, and that I would hear from him a little later. Well, sure enough, the following week, about Thursday, I got a letter from, or not a letter, but a phone call from Jack's dad again, and he said, it's all set. The general wants to see you. Well, not the general, the colonel, and he wants to see you. So I went out and we made arrangements that I would come out on the Monday morning. Well, I went out Monday morning, and I had Surge on. This is what we got for Gray and Simcoe Foresters. And as soon as he saw that, he got a hold of a character by the name of Pennington and took me down to the quartermaster stores and got me dressed properly. And after looking over the dress, he sent me down. He said, you're going down to the technical wing to Captain Philpott. Well, I went down to the technical wing, and there was some of the characters that are around here down. We're down the technical wing. And I was there about 3 weeks when Philpott was posted to England on a course, and I became it. And I'll never thank anybody so much as my Sergeant Major, Nick Lister. He just kept my head above water all the time. And we went along, and eventually while the old Renault tanks came in, we ganged up on the regiments that were in there. There was the Three Rivers, Sherbrooks. Who else was in there?
Ontario's.
Ontario's.
Yeah. Sherbrooks was still in infantry.
Oh, yeah.
They hadn't been converted.
Who's the other outfit then?
It would be the Calgaries, probably. Yeah.
Maybe. Anyway, we got the mechanics from them, And we got these characters working on getting these old tanks going, and it worked very well. We did pretty well. I think we had 200 going at one particular time, one time. And enough anyway that all the MPs from Ottawa came down to look them over, plus old Ralston, and everything was fine. Well, that was my association for partly in Borden, but except one, I must tell you this. And I was a second lieutenant at the time, and I was in the mess one day, and old Worthy came in, and he said, "Aren't you qualified yet?" I said, "No, I've been too damn busy." Smith. Remember Smithy?
Yeah, Carrington Smith.
George Carrington Smith. He nailed him, and I got a quick course around the gunnery wing and around the signals and so forth, and sure enough, about a week later, up came a fellow from Toronto to qualify me and asked me a lot of questions and so forth. I had a small course on the Vickers machine gun, a small course on the Lewis. And I soon realized that this fellow didn't know as much as I did, and it was a rubber stamp job, which it was. Anyway, I got another pip out of it pretty quick. And I stayed around we stayed down at the old hangar place, that's the entrance coming in for quite a while. And then Army Service Corps had wrangled a new hangar up to the far end of the town, and Worthy used a little influence, I think, didn't he? And we got that hangar, the beautiful spot. Eventually, why Ordnance took over, and I was transferred to Ordnance E, and we had a workshop. We took over the Ordnance. I took over a section of the Ordnance workshop in the camp with all the mechanics from the tech wing, or a lot of them, 20, I think I took down to about 20 mechanics, something like that. And we overhauled all the tanks down there. Previous to that, we've been doing it ourselves. So it wasn't too long after that, why Burns was promoted to brigadier, and he was taken, appointed at the 4th Armored Brigade headquarters, or 4th Armored Brigade, and down to the Debert, and he transferred me from Armored Corps to Ordnance and sent down to Debert as OC, his workshop commander, which I enjoyed very much. Well, we went overseas and one thing and another, and I'll never forget being in England and seeing old Worthy a few times. He was commanding of 4 Armored, or for a div. And I got a phone call from the hospital that General Worthing was in the hospital and he wanted to see me. So I went to the hospital that evening, and he was in there for some bronchial trouble, and he was having to have a vapor machine and take in this vapor and so forth, and he had concocted a modification or two that he wanted on this machine, so it was much easier for him. And he had this all out in paper, and he said with a twinkle in his eye when he was talking to me, he says, "I hope you don't find this a Heath Robinson effort." Which I didn't, fix it up. And then, of course, the old boy went back. He was transferred. I think he just broke his heart that he didn't take 4 div into battle. But he didn't. He came back here, and when I came back after serving overseas in the 3 div occupational force, and then in Ottawa for a year, I got a job as inspector of QMG services and kept me going across the country. I went into Edmonton, and the old boy was GOC Western Command, and I couldn't have had a nicer time in Edmonton. He was very, very nice and full of enthusiasm, and he's going to change this, change that, and do other things all the way through. The next time I saw him, I had been posted to Western Command as commandee out there, and he'd been retired, and he was living in Vancouver. And I went over to inspect some of the reaming workshops in Vancouver, and who did I see at the bench with a file making some modifications on some damn piece of equipment? Was old Worthy. He was a wonderful old character, and he did many things, although he was rough, but he was damn honest.
Now, my claim to fame is very modest. My father's more important than I am because he's part of the original group number 2. I just happened to join the Armored Corps because there was nothing else for a young fellow of 18 to do when the war broke out but to join up. So rather than try and tell dirty tales about how I survived the Canadian Army, I think I'll just run through some tidbits of information that brings together the whole of the school and the war before I go on to the people on my right here. First of all, I'd like you to understand that the total number of vehicles that we had in Canada at the outbreak of war were 12 Cardin Lloyds, and suppose there were no use apart from training of drivers. We had 16 Mark 6B tanks. They'd come in 2 lots. 2 came in 1938, and 14 came in August 1939. And that gave us a total of 28 vehicles. And at the time, before the war broke out, the total strength of the school, which included my father who couldn't drive, was 37 men. So, you know, there were other people that weren't drivers either. So they were pretty well staffed with vehicles in relation to what other regiments or armored units throughout the country were. An additional vehicle that was on, and which none of these gentlemen have mentioned, I'm quite surprised, and that's the old Dragon we had, which was a medium Dragon, which had originally come to be a gun tower for the artillery, and I guess the artillery didn't like the idea of track vehicles, George, I'm not sure. And anyways, it ended up as part of the complement of vehicles that were at the school. Then with the breakdown in France in 1940, the Brits then suddenly decided that they needed to have some production of vehicles, because I think they took to France something like 747 armored vehicles, tanks and armored cars, and 75% of them broke down. Now, this brings back the idea of the driving and maintenance and the vital importance of it. It wasn't enemy action that knocked out those damn vehicles. So the Brits thought that they had sent a couple of tanks over here to, you know, right up to the end, you know. I mean, the Brits still thought they had the best bloody fighting vehicles. And so they sent over a Valentine, which they were going to have manufactured from George's mentioned Angus shop, and a Matilda tank. Now, these were armed with 2-pounders and a Beza machine gun, which is British Empire Small Arms munitions people in the UK. The Matilda was taken down by the U.S. purchasing mission down to Washington, and the Americans weren't interested in it at all. They had at that particular time developed the M2 medium, and they were just going into the M3 medium, which became the Grant, or the Lee, and then the British modified the turret slightly and it became a Grant. And when that purchasing commission came back to Canada, came and visited Canada, because the head of it, at least the head of the armored side of it, Brigadier Pratt, was an old pal of Worthy's, he convinced the Canadians they should forget buying what they were thinking of doing, of getting a bunch of Crusader tanks, which turned out to be a real bust in the UK. And he convinced them they should go and look at these American ones, because he said the chassis, the motive power, and everything about them is so far superior to what they had in the UK. And that is where we suddenly came into the redesign of it to become the Ram tank, and I'm sure that Doug James can give a lot more of the detail about that. But that's how that trend started as a result of these tanks coming over. So then with the shortage of tanks, nobody could buy any. Even the U.S. didn't have, in 1940, didn't have any tanks to sell us. Then we came along with the Renaults, which the Canadian government got a nice deal. We got something over 200. I've never been able to find the exact figure. Some people say 225, 210, so on. Anyway, something over 200 Roger said, we got 200 running for a while until the first 30 Valentines came off the line down in Angus shops. So they came up. The Brits allowed us to get them because they were part of they were all part of British order by then. Roger mentioned something about the new hangar that we got. The Army Service Corps had a hangar built for vehicles. It was a brand new one. I think it's still standing in Borden, as a matter of fact. Well, what had happened was that McNaughton had come up to Borden early in 1939 because he was doing an inspection of the units. When he was appointed, he was called Inspector General. And so one of the places he came was to Camp Borden, and he saw the hangar in which the light tanks were in. Now, the light tanks at that time were in a building that had been built in 1916. Horse stable, he said, and it's quite possible it did have stalls in it. It was a very low building, and here he had all these armored vehicles in this particular shed. Well, Andy McNaughton went absolutely berserk, and he sent a blistering telegram on November the 3rd to the QMG, and he says, garage and workshop accommodation AFV training center is inadequate and constitutes a dangerous fire hazard involving tank equipment valued at approximately $500,000. That was when $500,000 was really $500,000. Cannot be replaced. And he demanded action, and he wanted to make sure that Worthy got the full home war establishment as well as the rifles that he had been begging for on hands and knees. So following that, suddenly all these hangars started to go up in Borden, better buildings and so on, all as a result of Andy McNaughton coming along. But about the same time, Worthy was still having trouble, and of course the government was still having trouble getting money. The Canadian government was trying to do the war on the cheap at this time, and France hadn't fallen, remember that. And so Worthy went down to the Military Institute in Toronto and gave a lecture to a number of people on what he thought was going to happen, and you can read the records, and he called the shot, what was going to happen. Well, he so impressed a group down in Toronto that they wanted to do something for him. And so he said, well, why don't you form an Armored Force Association? And these guys were pretty prominent, and I'll give you a list of the names of some of these fellows who will probably come to mind to some of them. One was Everett Bristol. He was in the mining business. Now, he had been a First World War machine gunner and had become a special assistant to the overseas minister in London in the First World War. R.S. McLaughlin, J.M. McDonnell, H. Lockhart Gordon. His son is that guy that had that famous budget for the Liberal Party some years ago. And F.J. Mulqueen. Now, to suggest that Worthy was trying to orchestrate something, well, maybe a bit wide of the mark, but boy, he was certainly an active collaborator in a lot of things that were going on. He suggested to Judith Robinson of the Toronto Telegram, or the Globe and Mail, that a Colonel Carter from the UK, who was a retired tank man, should do a series of articles, which he did do in the paper. And the next thing Worthy did was to send a letter to Ottawa saying that this Armored Force Association wanted to help him purchase an indoor gunnery practice range embodying the magic eye or photoelectric principle of a beam projection. Now, we're talking about today, they'd be calling them lasers, I suppose. He wanted to develop a mock-up gun which projected an arrow beam of light at ranges of 1,500 yards. He wanted to develop a basic training tank which could be used in the place of a fighting tank. That fell apart because we had loads of tanks later on. You know, the ones that just didn't pay off were good for training. He wanted training devices for the wireless training which could speed up the training of operators in radio telegraphy. And so what this group got him in the end were tape recording machines. The Army didn't have any of this kind of stuff. They also bought the first potato peeler for the A8 training center. Nobody had it in the Army. They were still having 6 guys out there peeling buckets or these baskets of potatoes. He wanted training equipment from the automotive industry, sexualized motors and things of this nature, neon light layouts to do circuitries and all the rest of it. So this letter went in, and it ran up against a very, I gather from listening to yesterday's discussion, a real gentleman, the Director of Mechanization and Artillery, Colonel N.O. Carr. And he says, it's a strange suggestion, yet it has merit. What they were worried about was the fact that the private groups were going to contribute money and it would make the government look cheap. In the end, the association was allowed to buy the equipment for Worthy, and the armored school up to that time was possibly, with that equipment that these people bought, was possibly the finest automotive training establishment in Canada. There's no question, in my mind anyways, at that time.